Hey Tricky, wanna do a collab on the Crystal Empire?
Nah, thanks, I pass.
Hey Tricky, wanna talk about my favorite villain?
Sorry, not feeling like it.
Sombra?
Nope. Hey Brawny, would you like to collab with me on the Crystal Empire?
Sure, why not?
But
So, the Crystal Empire, remember this one? It was somewhat controversial back in the days because its main villain was overshadowed by a blob of slime. That being said, I actually think that, while it certainly has its flaws, it aged pretty well and holds up better than some other two-parters. It has pretty decent pacing, and I can't really think of many scenes that were entirely unnecessary, which is more than I can say about some other newer two-parters, which tend to waste time on scenes that go nowhere and then rush the resolution. Here it is pretty straightforward. Twilight and friends get sent to the Crystal Empire to look for a way to save it, while King Sombra is trying to get in. As Cadence is getting weaker, it becomes a race against the clock, which results in some decent tension, unlike for example Shadowplay, where they had the means to take out Stygian right away.
I found the Crystal Empire to work on multiple levels. Indeed, it had the basic solid story, the race against time elements that you mentioned, but it also had an amazing life moral about the importance of knowing your history and how to overcome fear and depression through friendship and community.
This might be best illustrated by the second song of this episode. The Ballad of the Crystal Ponies does a very good job bringing this lesson across, as it is all about the importance of history and standing together. It also moves the plot along quite nicely in a montage as we see the main six preparing the Crystal Fair. Sadly, I can't quite say that about the Failure song, which contributes very little to the plot other than the general fact that Twilight feels overwhelmed by her task.
There's not many songs in the show that I like. The Ballad of the Crystal Empire, however, is one of them. I had trouble getting through the first part of the Failure song, mostly because of Spike's singing voice, but I think it was meant to reinforce that Twilight is confident in her abilities and accomplishments, but has just never faced anything on this scale before. The reprieve at the end of part 2, however, I outright skipped.
Well, in any case, perhaps the thing most people took issue with in this episode was the depiction of Sombra. He is intended to be more of a looming threat. If I remember things correctly, the writers compared him to Sauron from The Lord of the Rings. A villain that needs to be stopped, but actually does very little in the story directly. Sadly, many people consider him to be a weak villain as a result, as he doesn't really have a presence in the episode proper. We cut to him once in a while, but that's about it. He doesn't even have proper dialogue. However, I don't think that this does him justice. The very first thing he does when our heroes meet him is to block Shining Armor's ability to cast magic, which is already a pretty powerful feat. He shows some self-healing capabilities as well, and he only needed to bring a part of his horn behind the barrier to start corrupting the place. Not to mention that his traps are rather cleverly set up, especially the Nightmare Door and the trap that not only captures its victim, but also negates their magic, shows that he knew full well what he was doing. In fact, he seems to be in control all the way through and knew it was only a matter of time until he was to conquer the Crystal Empire again.
You've essentially said what I was telling people everywhere when the episode aired, and they were all calling him a lame villain who didn't do anything. Most people at the time missed the additional levels of symbolism that Sombra represents. This being what it's like to live in hopelessness. His effects on the Crystal Ponies and the Empire as a whole were felt throughout, even when shielded from his presence. From the way that they lacked energy and motivation, to how they couldn't remember anything about themselves, and even didn't want to. These are the effects that depression and oppression can have. He was a malicious, outside force that removed their only means of self-defense and tortured them in their own worst fears for however long he was in power for. Any attempt at defending themselves was met with obstacles that they could not overcome alone. It wasn't until Twilight approached the traps with the help of Spike, a friend, that she was able to work through these fears, overcome the traps, and deliver the Crystal Heart.
However, what cheapens him a bit as a villain is that he's treated as a rather trivial threat by Celestia, where pretty much every other villain is treated as a harbinger of the apocalypse. Celestia assures that Twilight can handle it without much of a problem. As a reminder, she risks the life of all the Crystal Ponies, the main 6, Spike, Cadence, and Shining Armor just to test Twilight, which seems rather reckless. What's even more, she tells Twilight that she must do it on her own to set up this lesson about self-sacrifice, which wouldn't be a problem if she hadn't told Twilight she must do it on her own. Not only that, she congratulates Twilight that she decided to put herself aside and that it was the right decision not to risk the life of the Crystal Ponies, when this is exactly what she did herself when she told Luna not to go, cause this is something Twilight must do. And while we are at it, why didn't they bring the elements of harmony along? Those would have been rather handy, just saying.
You're not wrong. Even as the episode was airing, I was a little unnerved by Celestia's lack of explicit contingency plan. It was either to make sure Twilight acted as if there was no safety net, or to raise the stakes of the episode from a meta standpoint. But I have no way of confirming either theory. I have to believe that, given what I know of Celestia's character, she would have had some kind of contingency. The plan was to see if Twilight would put herself before the needs of the Empire. If she had done so, it's entirely possible that Sombra would have defeated her and retaken control. If Celestia didn't know this, I would be very surprised. Perhaps because she and Luna had already defeated Sombra once, she knew that she could do it again. But even that is still speculation. Regardless, it's not like this method is entirely unheard of, at least where I come from. At a certain point in apprenticeship training, you reach a level commonly known as Journeyman, which is similar to what it sounds like. This is when the apprentice has reached such a level that they actually cannot be taught much more by a teacher. So all that remains is to set out on their own with the knowledge that they have and see if they can expand upon it. In martial arts, this is sometimes referred to as a warrior's journey, which expands on the practitioner's skill through real-world experience. Since we later learn that Celestia was preparing Twilight for an ascension to royalty, going through this step would be entirely necessary. If it had not been King Sombra, it would have been something similar.
In general, I do see the point behind the test, yes, but the point remains that the stakes are way too high for it. There's no way that Celestia could predict how things would go, as she herself said that she doesn't know much about the Crystal Empire, for example. That being said, we do know that Celestia and Luna did defeat Sombra in the past, with indication that they didn't even need the elements of harmony to do it. The little dialogue Luna has implies that she is actually confident enough to take Sombra on alone, which again makes him appear weaker than the other villains. Frankly, it appears to me that Celestia completely underestimated the threat though, which is further highlighted in the cutie remark in which we saw what would happen if no one stopped Sombra. Suddenly he became a threat that Celestia can't handle so easily. Not only that, there was no real reason for the writers to make this a test in the first place. Celestia could have simply said, "Hey Twilight, the Crystal Empire appeared, I already sent Shining Armor and Cadence to investigate that place, but it would be cool if you and your friends could help them out." The only thing that test does from a story perspective is to artificially raise the stakes and to give Twilight more to worry about.
That is very true. But there's also the case of the IDW Friends Forever series where Celestia tells Spike that she could interject, but needs to let Twilight find and grow her own strength, and that given what happened in the alternate timeline during Cutie Remark, Princess Celestia had an equal likelihood of failure or success. I think ultimately, our 2 points come down to speculation though, and beyond what has already been said, we can't really confirm or deny anything, unfortunately.
Now another thing that bothers me a little bit is that Twilight's friends mostly get busy work to keep them occupied. They are distracting the Crystal Ponies while Twilight is looking for the Crystal Heart. We do get a good chunk of funny scenes out of it, so I don't mind it too much, but frankly I do wish that they would have had a more active role in taking down Sombra by helping Twilight to get the Crystal Heart. I do think, however, that this episode really plays to Twilight's strengths. She gets to show off her leadership skills when interacting with the main 6, and Sombra's trap require her quick thinking and creative use of magic to overcome. And this is where Twilight really gets to shine. The only thing that bothers me is her inner conflict about her self-sacrifice when she has to decide between saving everyone and passing her test, as the entire conflict of the test feels, as I mentioned earlier, way too artificial. I also think it's a bit weird that they established that Celestia and Twilight can use what I can only describe as dark magic without really elaborating on it. It just seems like something that needs to be explored more, but sadly they kinda ignored it after Twilight used it to open the gates to Sombra's hideout.
But that would have its drawbacks as well. Certainly, the rest of the main six could have ganged up on Sombra, but what would that have accomplished? The secret to success wasn't in the main six. It was in the Crystal Empire as a community. Sombra, being a metaphor for depression and an overtly tyrannical ruler, could only be defeated by remembering your community's history and its strengths and being together for each other. If the main six hadn't put on the Crystal Fair to lift their spirits, the Crystal Ponies wouldn't have been uplifted enough to bond together and activate the Crystal Heart.
I do have to give this episode some credit for Cadence and Shining Armor. Those two often get criticized for being rather bland, and while they don't get that much screen time in this episode, they actually have a pretty decent showing. Shining shows his willingness to fight and is only so inactive throughout the episode because Sombra blocks his magic, and Twilight says that he should keep Cadence company. Cadence on the other paw mirrors the actions of Shining Armor in the Canterlot wedding and keeps up a magic barrier for days without any sleep, showing a lot of determination and power. Both are as proactive as the episode allows them to be, and frankly, they certainly contribute more to the plot than Celestia ever has, so kudos to them. Also, that scene in which Shining Armor throws Cadence to save the day is just hilarious and shows some rather quick thinking.
I have nothing to say to that. I agree entirely.
Well, I guess this is a good point to wrap things up. The Crystal Empire is a pretty solid two-parter. Frankly, the only thing that keeps it down in my opinion is the whole "this is just a test" premise. Either it is a contrived setup to artificially raise the stakes and make Celestia look reckless at best, downright stupid at worst, or it undermines the tension this episode tries to build, as you could rationalize that Sombra is not as big of a threat as he appears, and that Celestia could always swoop in and save everyone without any problems should things go south for whatever reason. Besides that, I think that Sombra actually has a rather impressive showing as a villain despite his lack of screen time. This is mostly because this episode knows how to use the little time it has. It only shows as much of Sombra as it needs to, and rather focuses on other things which aren't less important. As a result, it is perhaps the only two-parter that doesn't feel completely rushed near the end, and there's barely anything I would consider filler besides the failure song. I too was at first a bit underwhelmed by this episode, but with time I learned to appreciate it a lot more.
Although I love just about all of the season openers, this one still takes a narrow victory as my favorite so far. I find that a lot of people have trouble understanding why I think this episode is so great, but I can respect that. I'll still be relishing any chance we get to see the show's smartest villain in action.
You're right, we should definitely talk more about Sombra. Hey Countess, wanna do a video on King Sombra?
Oh, come on!
Sly as a fox, you got me under your spell. But you know I'll never tell that I know you know so well.